Alice Williams was no stranger to hard work. Growing up in a small, close-knit community, she learned early on that if you wanted something in life, you had to work for it. Her mother, a woman of quiet strength and resilience, had instilled in her a strong sense of dignity and pride. These values were her guiding stars, and they carried her through tough times, through the discrimination she faced, and through the endless days of low-paying jobs just to make ends meet. Now, standing at the entrance of the Grand Harrison estate, Alice took a deep breath. The Harrison Mansion was a sprawling structure, an architectural masterpiece with high ceilings, marble floors, and ornate chandeliers that glistened in the afternoon sun. The elegance of the home was overwhelming. Each corner of the mansion a testament to a life of privilege and luxury Alice could only imagine. She knew that working here, if she could manage to stay, would offer her a rare opportunity. The wages were better than anything she'd earned before, and with the Harrison name on her resume, doors might open in the future that had previously been closed to her. However, Alice quickly discovered that working for the Harrison family would test her patience and resilience more than any other job had. The estate was managed by the family's only son, Matt Harrison, a man of unyielding pride and arrogance. Matt was in his early 30s, tall and sharply dressed, with a gaze that felt like it could pierce through steel. He had the kind of privileged upbringing that seemed to make him view anyone outside his social class with contempt. His casual condescension felt like a dagger wrapped in silk, always cutting but never loud, his cruelty subtle yet profoundly humiliating. From the first day, Matt scrutinized Alice's every move. He watched her clean, his arms crossed, his cold blue eyes following her as if she were an insect under a microscope. On her second day, as she was polishing a table in the drawing room, he walked in, his eyes narrowing in disapproval. "I hope you're aware that we expect perfection here," he remarked, his tone dripping with disdain. "This isn't the sort of place where you can get away with shortcuts. We have standards, you understand." Alice paused for a moment, her fingers tightening around the cloth. The insult was clear, though cloaked in the thinnest veil of civility. She felt a surge of anger, a desire to say something to defend herself, but she held her tongue. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Never let them see you rattle. Hold your head high, no matter what they say." "Yes, Mr. Harrison," she replied quietly, lowering her gaze to the table and continuing her work. Days turned into weeks, and every morning Alice would arrive early, moving through the grand halls and lavish rooms with quiet grace, doing her best to meet Matt's impossible standards. She took pride in her work, even if it went unappreciated. Each day, she would polish the silver until it gleamed, scrub the marble floors until they shone, and dust the countless shelves that lined the walls of the Harrison Library. She worked tirelessly, but nothing she did ever seemed good enough for Matt. He took a strange satisfaction in finding fault with her efforts. A missed speck of dust, a slightly uneven shine on the floor. Each minor flaw became a reason for him to lecture her, his tone a mixture of mockery and irritation. "Is this the best you can do, Alice?" he would sneer, his voice laced with disdain. "I'm not paying you to slack off." Alice endured each cutting remark with patience, refusing to let her frustration show. She poured all of her anger into her work, polishing and scrubbing until her hands ached, her back stiff from hours of bending and lifting. She knew she could leave, find work elsewhere, but she refused to let Matt drive her away. She was here to stay, not just for herself, but to prove to herself, and perhaps even to him, that she was stronger than he thought. One afternoon, after hours of cleaning, Alice was in the kitchen, taking a brief moment to rest. She leaned against the counter, closing her eyes, relishing the quiet. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her, and a chill ran down her spine. She turned to see Matt standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Taking a break already?" he asked, his tone mocking. "It's barely afternoon. I would have thought someone in your position would have a bit more endurance." Alice's face flushed, but she kept her expression neutral. She straightened, brushing her hands on her apron, and met his gaze with a quiet dignity. "I was just about to get back to work, Mr. Harrison." "Good," he replied, his smirk widening. "Because I expect the floors in the main hall to be spotless by evening, and there's a stain on the library carpet that's been bothering me for days. Make sure it's gone by tomorrow." "Yes, sir," Alice replied, her voice steady. As Matt turned to leave, Alice felt a pang of bitterness. How could someone so wealthy, so privileged, lack even the most basic respect for others? She knew that to him, she was just another servant, another faceless worker to be used and discarded. But what he didn't realize was that every word he spoke, every condescending look he gave her, only strengthened her resolve. That evening, as Alice was cleaning the library, she noticed something strange. She reached up to dust a high shelf and felt her fingers brush against a stack of letters, carefully hidden behind a row of books. Out of curiosity, she pulled them out, glancing at the unfamiliar handwriting. The letters were addressed to Matt, and as she skimmed over the first few lines, she felt a twinge of surprise. They were letters from his estranged mother, who had left the family years ago, pleading for him to let go of his bitterness and resentment. The words were filled with regret, love, and a longing for reconciliation. As she read the letters, Alice began to see a different side of Matt. Beneath his arrogance and disdain, there was a deep hurt, a vulnerability that he had buried under layers of pride and anger. His cruelty, she realized, was a mask he wore to hide his own insecurities, his own pain. The discovery left her conflicted. On one hand, she felt a sense of pity for Matt, an understanding of the wounds that had shaped him into the man he was. But on the other, she knew that his suffering didn't excuse his treatment of her. She had her own struggles, her own burdens, yet she had never used them as an excuse to demean others. Over the next few days, Alice couldn't stop thinking about the letters. She continued her work, as meticulous and dedicated as ever. But now she saw Matt in a different light. Each time he spoke to her with his usual condescension, she couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy, even as his words stung. She understood now that his arrogance wasn't rooted in malice, but in a deep-seated pain that he was unable, or unwilling, to confront. One day, while she was dusting in his office, she noticed him watching her from the doorway, his expression inscrutable. He looked almost lost, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Alice felt a flicker of connection, a silent understanding that passed between them. Matt quickly averted his gaze, clearing his throat. "I expect the office to be spotless," he mumbled, his usual bravado absent. He turned and left, leaving Alice with a faint glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to Matt than the arrogant facade he wore so proudly. And as she resumed her work, Alice found herself wondering if, despite everything, she might be able to reach him, to help him see the world, and the people in it, in a different light. Alice returned to the mansion the next morning, her mind still on the letters she'd discovered. She knew she shouldn't have read them, that they were private, but something about the raw, vulnerable words written by Matt's estranged mother had drawn her in. She could hardly reconcile the man she sought every day with the boy his mother described, a boy once filled with curiosity, laughter, and love, who had somehow grown up to become bitter and cold. That morning, she was assigned to clean the grand hall, a vast, echoing room lined with marble pillars and gilded mirrors. Her movements were methodical, her hands steady as she polished the ornate wooden furniture and dusted the grand portraits that lined the walls. Most were of Matt's ancestors, each face exuding an air of nobility and stern pride, their features carved by both privilege and responsibility. As she looked at the portraits, she wondered if they too had struggled with the pressures of legacy, if they had hidden insecurities beneath those carefully crafted expressions. Alice was deep in thought when she heard a familiar voice echoing from the hallway. "Alice." Matt's tone was sharp, almost irritated, and she instinctively straightened, her hands clenching around her duster. She turned to see him striding into the room, dressed in a tailored suit, his face set in its usual mask of disinterest and disdain. "Yes, Mr. Harrison," she replied, keeping her voice calm and professional. He glanced around the room, his gaze sharp, as though searching for something to criticize. "I noticed some dust on the chandelier in the entryway. It's unacceptable. Make sure it's spotless by the end of the day." Alice suppressed a sigh. The chandelier in the entryway was massive, suspended high above the ground, and cleaning it was a task that would require both a ladder and patience. But she simply nodded, refusing to let him see her frustration. "Of course, Mr. Harrison. I'll take care of it." He nodded curtly, already turning to leave, but paused midway, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than usual. There was something strange in his gaze, a flicker of hesitation that seemed almost out of character. "Alice," he said slowly, as if choosing his words carefully, "I noticed you. You seem to work hard. Very hard, actually." His voice was quieter, almost thoughtful, and for a moment she thought she saw a hint of softness in his expression. She met his gaze, caught off guard by this uncharacteristic remark. "Thank you, sir," she replied, unsure of how else to respond. He looked away, his face hardening again. "Don't let it get to your head. It's just an observation," he muttered before walking away, leaving her alone in the grand hall once more. Alice watched him go, her heart pounding with a mix of frustration and curiosity. She had seen a glimpse of something buried deep beneath his layers of arrogance and bitterness. But just as quickly as it had appeared, it had vanished, replaced by his usual coldness. She shook her head, pushing the thought aside, and resumed her work. Hours later, she found herself perched on a ladder beneath the grand chandelier in the entryway, carefully polishing each crystal that hung from its ornate structure. It was painstaking work, and she moved slowly, her arms growing sore from the repetitive motions. The house was quiet, with most of the staff having retreated to the kitchen for their midday break, and she relished the rare moment of solitude. As she polished the chandelier, Alice's mind drifted back to the letters she had found in Matt's office. She wondered what had driven his mother away, what had left Matt so deeply scared that he now hid behind his arrogance and cruelty. She couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for him, even though she knew he didn't deserve it. People often built walls around their hearts to protect themselves, and she sensed that Matt's wall was particularly thick, fortified by years of bitterness and pain. Just as she finished polishing the last crystal, she heard footsteps approaching. She looked down from her perch to see Matt standing at the base of the ladder, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her with an unreadable expression. "Alice," he called up, his voice softer than usual. "I didn't expect you to finish so quickly." She climbed down the ladder carefully, dusting off her hands as she met his gaze. "I take my work seriously, Mr. Harrison," she replied, keeping her tone polite but firm. He nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "It's admirable, I suppose," he said, almost reluctantly. There was a strange vulnerability in his expression, a flicker of something unguarded that she hadn't seen before. Alice hesitated, feeling a rare courage rising within her. "Mr. Harrison," she began carefully, "may I ask you something?" He raised an eyebrow, surprised by her sudden boldness. "You're not exactly in a position to be asking questions, are you?" he replied, though his tone lacked its usual edge. She ignored his remark, her gaze steady. "Why do you treat me this way? I know I'm just the help to you, but I work hard, and I don't understand why you seem to go out of your way to make things difficult for me." For a moment, Matt looked taken aback, as if no one had ever questioned his behavior before. He opened his mouth to respond, but then closed it, his gaze flickering with something she couldn't quite identify. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because you remind me of someone I'd rather forget." Alice's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding. She hadn't expected him to answer, much less with something so raw, so honest. "Someone you'd rather forget," she echoed, her voice soft. He looked away, his jaw clenched. My mother. She was like you, I suppose. Hardworking, dignified. She left when I was young, and I never understood why. His voice was laced with bitterness, but there was a hint of sadness beneath it, a glimpse of the boy he had once been. Alice felt a pang of sympathy, her earlier frustration melting away. I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison, she said gently. I didn't mean to bring up painful memories. He let out a bitter laugh, his gaze turning cold once more. Don't waste your sympathy on me, Alice. I don't need it. She nodded, understanding that he wasn't ready to confront his pain, that he wasn't yet willing to let go of the bitterness that had consumed him. But as she watched him walk away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen a different side of him, a side that he kept hidden from the world. Over the next few days, Alice continued her work with renewed determination. She treated Matt with the same respect as always, but there was a subtle shift in her attitude, a quiet strength that he couldn't ignore. She no longer allowed his taunts to affect her, no longer let his condescension make her feel small. She had seen the vulnerability beneath his harsh exterior, and it gave her a strange sense of power. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Matt began to change as well. His insults grew less frequent, his criticisms less biting. He would watch her as she worked, his gaze thoughtful, as if he were trying to understand the quiet dignity that she carried within her. He still wore his mask of arrogance, but there were cracks in it now, cracks that allowed glimpses of the man he could be, if only he would let go of his pain. One evening, as Alice was finishing her tasks for the day, she caught Matt watching her from across the room. He seemed hesitant, almost as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. "Good night, Mr. Harrison," she said, offering him a polite nod as she prepared to leave. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer. "Good night, Alice," he replied, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. As she walked out of the room, Alice couldn't help but smile. She knew that Matt had a long way to go, that his wounds were deep and his walls high. But she also knew that change was possible, that even the hardest hearts could soften with time. And as she closed the door behind her, she felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that perhaps, one day, he would learn to see her not as the help, but as a person, worthy of respect and kindness. The days turned into weeks, and as Alice continued her duties in the Harrison residence, she noticed more changes in Matt. He still held on to his pride, but the sharpness in his words had dulled, replaced by something closer to curiosity, perhaps even respect. He would often linger in the background, watching her with a thoughtful expression as she moved through the grand halls and polished the intricate carvings on the antique furniture. One morning, Alice was in the library, dusting the endless rows of books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. She couldn't help but admire the sheer volume of knowledge contained within these walls, a collection that spoke of generations of Harrisons, each one adding their intellectual legacy to the shelves. Matt's father, a well-known businessman and philanthropist, had been an avid reader, and the library bore the evidence of his interests: economics, history, law, and political science. It was a room of intellectual richness, and Alice felt a quiet reverence for the knowledge held there, even though she had no formal education beyond high school. As she worked, her fingers brushing over the spines of books, Matt entered the library. She hadn't noticed him at first, lost in thought as she reached for a particularly high shelf, balancing on the tips of her toes. He cleared his throat, and she nearly lost her balance, startled. "Oh, Mr. Harrison, I didn't see you there," she said, regaining her footing and straightening up. He gave her a slight smile, a rare expression that softened his usually stern face. "I didn't mean to startle you. I was just watching." He quickly corrected himself. "I mean, observing. You seem to have a particular reverence for this place." Alice paused, uncertain how much to reveal. She nodded politely. "The library is impressive, sir. I can see it's been well taken care of over the years." Matt's gaze shifted to the books, his eyes clouded with a touch of nostalgia. My father built this library. He believed in the power of knowledge and taught me that every answer I could ever need would be found in these books. He let out a small, bitter laugh. I didn't always appreciate his advice. Alice sensed a vulnerability in his words and took a tentative step forward. It must have been wonderful, having a father who valued knowledge so much. Not everyone is blessed with that kind of encouragement. Matt's face softened, the bitterness receding slightly. You're right. He was a complicated man, strict, demanding, but he had a vision for me. A vision I didn't always understand. He paused, then added quietly, sometimes I wonder if I've lived up to it. The honesty in his voice caught Alice off guard. This was a side of Matt she hadn't seen before, a man uncertain of his worth, burdened by the weight of expectations. She chose her words carefully, hoping to reach him. Mr. Harrison, from what I've seen, living up to someone else's vision can be difficult, especially when it's unclear what they truly wanted for us. But I believe that ultimately, it's about finding your own path, discovering what makes you proud of yourself. Matt looked at her, something shifting in his gaze. And what makes you proud, Alice? Why do you work so hard here, despite the way I've treated you? Her answer came without hesitation. My mother. She raised me to be strong, to face life with dignity, no matter what. She always said that respect isn't given, it's earned, through perseverance and integrity. I suppose I want to honor her by showing that her sacrifices weren't in vain. He studied her for a long moment, his expression inscrutable. Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman. She is, Alice replied, smiling softly. She taught me that everyone, no matter where they come from, has something valuable to offer the world. Matt nodded slowly, as if absorbing her words. For a moment, the silence between them was comfortable, a shared understanding bridging the gap that had once felt insurmountable. But then, as if realizing he was allowing himself to be vulnerable, Matt straightened, his face hardening slightly. Well, he said briskly, breaking the spell, I'd better leave you to your work. He turned to go, but before he could leave, Alice spoke up. Mr. Harrison, I mean Matt. He paused, glancing back at her with a slight frown. Yes, I just wanted to say, I think your father would be proud of you. You've built something here, something substantial, even if it's not exactly what he envisioned. You're carrying on his legacy in your own way. Her words seemed to strike him deeply, his expression softening again. For a brief moment, he looked almost vulnerable, as though she had touched on something he'd kept buried for a long time. Thank you, Alice, he said quietly. I don't hear that often. She nodded, and he left the library, leaving her alone amidst the shelves of wisdom and history. She watched him go, feeling a flicker of hope that perhaps, in some small way, she was helping him confront his own pain. The following days brought a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere of the mansion. Matt's demands were fewer, his criticisms softer, and his interactions with Alice took on a more respectful tone. He still held on to his aloof demeanor, but there was a gentleness now that hadn't been there before, a hint of humility in his gaze. One afternoon, while Alice was arranging fresh flowers in a vase by the grand staircase, Matt approached her, his hands tucked into his pockets, a hesitant look on his face. Alice, he began, his voice uncharacteristically unsure. I wanted to ask you if you'd be interested in attending a gala with me. It's a charity event my family has sponsored for years, and I thought, perhaps you might like to see it, as a guest. Alice blinked in surprise, her heart skipping a beat. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Are you asking me to go as your guest, Mr. Harrison? He looked away, a faint blush creeping up his cheeks. Yes, I suppose I am. It's just, I thought you might enjoy it. You've been working so hard, and perhaps it could be a small break from the daily routine. Alice felt a warmth spread through her chest. She knew that this was more than just an invitation. It was an acknowledgement of her worth, a gesture of respect from a man who had once treated her as invisible. She nodded, a smile lighting up her face. "Thank you, Matt. I'd be honored to attend." That evening, as Alice prepared for the gala, she looked at herself in the mirror, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her hair styled in loose waves, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was her moment, a chance to step out of the shadows and stand as an equal beside the man who had once looked down on her. When she arrived at the gala, Matt was waiting for her by the entrance, looking dashing in a tailored suit. He greeted her with a warm smile, his eyes soft as he took in her appearance. "You look beautiful, Alice," he said quietly, his voice filled with a genuine admiration that made her heart race. The evening was a whirlwind of introductions, conversations, and laughter. For the first time, Matt introduced her to his peers, not as his employee, but as his guest, and she saw a different side of him. Charming, engaging, and dare she say, kind. The people around them seemed captivated by her grace and dignity, and she caught a few envious glances from women in the crowd. But she paid them no mind, focusing instead on enjoying the night and the rare sense of freedom that came with it. As the evening drew to a close, Matt walked her out to the terrace, where the stars sparkled above them in the clear night sky. They stood in comfortable silence, the soft murmur of the party fading behind them. "Thank you, Alice," Matt said finally, his voice filled with emotion, "for showing me that there's more to life than pride and wealth. I never thought I'd meet someone like you, someone who could see past all my flaws." She looked at him, her gaze steady. "Everyone has flaws, Matt, but it's what we do with them that defines us." He smiled, reaching out to take her hand. In that moment, beneath the stars, they were no longer employer and employee, no longer separated by class or wealth. They were simply two people, each healing in their own way, each finding a new path forward. For the first time, Alice felt that she truly belonged, not because of her status, but because she had earned respect and friendship through her strength, grace, and unshakable dignity. As the weeks passed after the gala, Alice began noticing even more profound changes in Matt. He had become more considerate, not just to her, but to the entire household staff. The man who once wore his entitlement like a shield seemed softer, more reflective. He would occasionally join the staff for brief conversations in the kitchen, inquiring about their lives, their families, and even their dreams. To Alice, it was as though the walls Matt had built around himself were slowly coming down. Yet, she couldn't help but wonder how genuine these changes were. She knew that true transformation wasn't always easy or linear, and she was cautious, afraid that this newfound kindness might just be a fleeting phase. She wasn't ready to lower her own defenses completely, despite the moments they'd shared. There were times when she still remembered his cold gaze, his harsh words, the way he had initially treated her, as if she were beneath him. That memory held her back, keeping her from fully embracing this new version of Matt. One evening, as she was finishing up in the dining room, she heard Matt's voice calling her from down the hall. "Alice, would you mind joining me in the study for a moment?" Curious, Alice set down her cleaning cloth and made her way to the study. The study was one of her favorite rooms in the house. Cozy, lined with books, and filled with a warm glow from the dimly lit lamps and crackling fireplace. As she entered, she found Matt seated behind his large mahogany desk, a stack of papers, and an old, worn, leather-bound journal in front of him. "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. She hesitated briefly, then took the seat, feeling a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Is everything all right, Mr. Harrison?" she asked, folding her hands in her lap. Matt shook his head with a small smile. "You know, you can call me Matt. I think we've known each other long enough for that." Alice gave him a tentative smile in return. "All right, Matt. Is everything okay?" He nodded, though there was a tension in his expression that told her something more was on his mind. After a moment, he took a deep breath and pushed the journal toward her. "This belonged to my father," he began. "I found it a few days ago, tucked away in a drawer I hadn't opened in years. It's his personal journal. He wrote in it regularly, detailing his thoughts, his worries, and his regrets." Alice looked down at the journal, her fingers brushing over the worn leather cover. She glanced back up at Matt, sensing the vulnerability he was trying to share. "It must have been difficult for you to read," she said gently. Matt nodded, his gaze distant. "It was. He wrote about his hopes for me, about how he wanted me to carry on the family legacy. But he also wrote about the mistakes he made, the things he wished he'd done differently. In one of his entries, he admitted he regretted focusing so much on wealth and status, on how those things shaped my upbringing. He feared he'd raised me to become someone who lacked compassion, empathy." His voice broke slightly, and he cleared his throat, looking down at his hands. "It's strange, Alice. I've always idolized him, seen him as this unbreakable figure. But reading his words, I realized he was just a man, flawed and struggling, just like the rest of us." Alice's heart ached for him. She knew what it was like to see someone you love in a new, more human light, to understand that the people we look up to are not perfect, that they carry their own burdens, their own regrets. "I think, realizing that makes him even more remarkable," Alice said softly. "He recognized his mistakes, and he wanted better for you. That takes courage." Matt looked up at her, his gaze intense. "He did. And reading this has made me realize how far I've strayed from the man he hoped I'd become. I don't know why I treated you the way I did, Alice. I don't know why I held on to such bitterness, such arrogance. But now, I see it. I see the damage it's done, not just to you, but to me too." Alice remained silent, allowing him the space to continue. She could see how hard this admission was for him, and she didn't want to interrupt. "I guess I wanted to apologize," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just for the way I treated you, but for everything I've represented. I know an apology doesn't erase the hurt I caused, but I want you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be someone worthy of the respect you've shown me, even when I didn't deserve it." Alice looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of insincerity, but all she found was honesty. She knew this moment was genuine, that he was bearing a part of himself he'd kept hidden for far too long. "Thank you, Matt," she replied, her voice steady. "I accept your apology. And I'm grateful for the changes I've seen in you. It takes strength to confront ourselves, to admit our flaws. That's something not everyone is willing to do." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling around them. Finally, Matt took a deep breath, seeming lighter somehow, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. "There's one more thing," he said, a hint of nervousness in his tone. I've been thinking about everything you shared with me about your mother, about how much she sacrificed for you. And it made me realize I want to give back in some way." Alice looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" Matt's gaze softened. "I've decided to start a scholarship fund. In your mother's name. It will provide financial support to young people from underprivileged backgrounds, people who, like you, have dreams but lack the means to pursue them. I know it's not much, but it's a start." Tears sprang to Alice's eyes, and she covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Matt, I don't know what to say. This is incredible." He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "You inspired me, Alice. You showed me what it means to have strength, resilience, and grace. I wanted to do something that honors that, something that ensures others have the chance to achieve their dreams, just as you've helped me realize mine." She felt a surge of gratitude, a warmth that spread through her chest. "Thank you, Matt. My mother, she would be so proud. This means more to me than you could ever know." They sat in companionable silence, the bond between them deepening in ways that words couldn't fully express. In that moment, they were no longer employer and employee. They were simply two people, each changed by the other, each finding a way to move forward with new purpose. As the evening wore on, Matt shared more of his father's journal entries with her, and they laughed and reminisced, each story bringing them closer together. For the first time, Alice felt truly seen, not as a maid, but as a person, as an equal. And for the first time, Matt felt the joy of connecting with someone beyond wealth, beyond status. In that study, under the warm glow of the fireplace, they'd forged a friendship built on understanding, respect, and shared growth. They were two people who had started from opposite worlds, yet somehow they had found a common ground, a shared humanity. It was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them, one where kindness, empathy, and genuine respect would guide their paths forward. And as Alice left the study that night, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that she had helped Matt become a better man, and in turn had discovered her own strength and purpose. As weeks turned into months, Alice and Matt's relationship continued to evolve in ways neither of them had anticipated. The initial hostility that Matt had shown her had long faded, replaced by a genuine friendship grounded in mutual respect. The entire household staff noticed the transformation. Gone was the arrogant, condescending Hare who once seemed to take pleasure in their discomfort. In his place was a man who had learned to listen, to be kind, and to show gratitude for those who kept his life running smoothly. Alice, for her part, had found herself with a growing confidence. She was no longer simply surviving in her role. She was thriving. Her ideas were valued, her voice was heard, and she had even been tasked by Matt with helping to manage the other staff. The scholarship fund Matt had started in honor of her mother had launched successfully, with the first round of recipients announced in a small ceremony that brought Alice to tears. Seeing the hopeful faces of young people who would now have the chance to pursue their dreams filled her with a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known she was missing. But change, she had come to realize, was a journey with peaks and valleys. For every moment of growth, there were moments of doubt, of challenge, and sometimes setbacks. And one such challenge was fast approaching, in the form of Matt's estranged mother, Catherine Harrison. Alice had heard snippets about Catherine from the other staff, and had gleaned some insights from Matt's own reluctant mentions of her. Catherine was a force to be reckoned with, a woman of high social standing, known for her sharp wit and sharper tongue. She had spent most of her life in New York, traveling frequently for charity events, fashion shows, and galas. The Harrison estate had once been her home, but she had spent little time there in recent years. When Alice learned of Catherine's imminent visit, she couldn't help but feel a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. The day Catherine arrived, the entire household seemed to hold its breath. The estate was pristine, the staff was on high alert, and Matt himself seemed unusually tense. Alice was busy arranging fresh flowers in the foyer when Catherine swept into the room, her presence filling the space as though she were royalty. Catherine was striking, with silver-streaked hair pulled back into an elegant chignon and eyes that were as sharp as her carefully tailored designer suit. She assessed the room with a critical eye before her gaze settled on Alice. Her lips pursed slightly, and Alice felt a chill as Catherine's eyes traveled up and down, clearly assessing her. "You must be Alice," Catherine said, her voice cool but tinged with curiosity. "The maid my son speaks so highly of these days." Alice forced a polite smile, meeting Catherine's gaze with as much composure as she could muster. "Yes, Mrs. Harrison, it's a pleasure to meet you." Catherine's gaze lingered, as though she were trying to unravel a puzzle. "Pleasure, indeed," she murmured, more to herself than to Alice, before turning her attention back to Matt, who had just entered the room. "Matthew, darling," she said, her voice softening, though her eyes remained calculating. "I see you've made some changes." Matt gave his mother a brief embrace. "Yes, Mother, a few changes. I think you'll find them to be for the better." They exchanged pleasantries, though Alice couldn't help but notice the undercurrent of tension between them. Catherine's presence seemed to disrupt the newfound peace Matt had worked so hard to cultivate. It was clear to Alice that Catherine represented a part of Matt's past that he had yet to fully come to terms with, a part that clashed with the man he was trying to become. Throughout the day, Catherine made her rounds of the estate, scrutinizing every detail, from the decor to the staff, with an air of critical detachment. When she found Alice in the kitchen later that afternoon, preparing tea, she leaned against the doorway and studied her silently for a moment. "Alice, isn't it?" Catherine began, folding her arms as she watched Alice with an expression that was hard to read. "Tell me, how long have you been working here?" "Nearly a year, Mrs. Harrison," Alice replied, keeping her tone respectful but firm. "And I hear you've been given quite a bit of responsibility. Managing the staff, advising on certain matters," Catherine said, her gaze narrowing slightly. "Yes," Alice responded calmly. "Mr. Harrison entrusted me with those responsibilities." Catherine's lips curved into a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Interesting," she murmured, her gaze lingering. "I suppose Matthew has changed since I last saw him. He's become rather unorthodox." Alice held her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "He's become someone who cares deeply about making a positive impact, Mrs. Harrison. He's taken steps to support those who need it, and he's made changes that benefit everyone in this household." Catherine's eyes flashed, and for a moment, Alice thought she saw something akin to respect flicker in her expression. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a look of mild amusement. "You speak as though you know him well." "I've seen him grow into someone I respect," Alice said, meeting Catherine's gaze directly. "He's learning to see people for who they are, not where they come from." Catherine regarded her for a long moment, then let out a soft chuckle. "You're certainly different from the others," she remarked, as though Alice were some kind of specimen she had yet to categorize. "I can see why Matthew finds you so intriguing." With that, Catherine swept out of the room, leaving Alice standing there, feeling a mixture of frustration and defiance. She knew Catherine was testing her, probing for weaknesses, perhaps even trying to find fault. But Alice was determined not to let herself be diminished by Catherine's probing gaze or thinly veiled insinuations. Later that evening, as Alice finished her tasks and prepared to retire for the night, she found herself summoned to the drawing room. When she arrived, she saw Matt and Catherine seated across from each other, their expressions tense. "Alice," Matt said, gesturing for her to join them, "my mother and I were just discussing the scholarship fund, the one named after your mother." Alice glanced between them, feeling the weight of Catherine's scrutiny once again. She nodded. "Yes, it's been a wonderful opportunity for so many young people." Catherine tilted her head, her expression thoughtful but guarded. "And you believe that this initiative is truly impactful?" she asked, her tone laced with skepticism. "Yes, I do," Alice replied confidently. "It gives people a chance they wouldn't otherwise have, a chance to build a future for themselves and their families." Catherine's gaze softened slightly, and she looked at Matt. "Well, it seems you found yourself a formidable ally, Matthew." Matt smiled, a hint of pride in his expression. "I have, Mother, and she's helped me realize what truly matters." There was a long silence, and then Catherine rose, looking at Alice with a hint of respect in her eyes. "Very well. It's clear that you're more than just an employee, Alice. Perhaps I underestimated you." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Matt and Alice alone. As soon as Catherine was gone, Matt let out a deep sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry about that. My mother, she can be difficult." Alice shook her head, offering him a reassuring smile. "It's all right, Matt. I know she's just protective in her own way." He looked at her with gratitude. "Thank you, Alice, for everything. I couldn't have come this far without you." Alice felt a warmth spread through her. She had once thought that her role in the Harrison estate would be limited to cleaning and serving, but here she was, a trusted advisor and friend. She had earned her place, and she knew she had made a difference in Matt's life. As she prepared to leave for the night, She felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just a maid in a grand house. She was part of something larger, a journey of transformation, of growth, of making a lasting impact. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. Catherine's visit had sown seeds of change that would continue to blossom in ways she had never imagined, challenging her, testing her resolve, and ultimately proving that one person's courage and kindness could indeed transform even the hardest of hearts. The days following Catherine's visit felt like a new chapter for everyone in the Harrison estate. Catherine, who had initially seemed critical and skeptical, stayed on longer than anyone expected. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, her icy demeanor began to thaw. Alice noticed subtle changes in Catherine's behavior. She no longer scrutinized the staff with her usual haughty gaze. Instead, she watched them with a contemplative expression, as if she were seeing the people who maintained her family's world for the first time. On more than one occasion, Alice caught Catherine lingering in the hallway, listening intently to conversations or simply observing the rhythm of the household. Catherine was trying to understand the new world Matt was building, and Alice's role in it. One afternoon, as Alice was overseeing the setup for a charity luncheon that Matt had decided to host, Catherine approached her. She wore a soft expression that Alice hadn't seen before, almost an apology, but not quite. "Alice," Catherine began, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Alice nodded, setting down the floral arrangement she was working on. "Of course, Mrs. Harrison." Catherine took a deep breath, as if gathering her thoughts. "I want to apologize for how I behaved when I first arrived," she said, meeting Alice's gaze directly. I wasn't prepared for the changes Matt has made here, or the ways in which you've impacted his life. It's clear to me now that you are more than a servant. You're a confidant, a guide. And I realize now that I was wrong to judge you based on appearances." Alice was taken aback, but she maintained her calm demeanor. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison," she replied. "I appreciate that. But I don't take offense. I understand that change is difficult." Catherine nodded, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "You're wise beyond your years, Alice. I see now why my son values your opinion so highly." They stood in silence for a moment, and then Catherine surprised Alice by reaching out and placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You've done more for my son in a few months than I managed in his entire life," she admitted, a touch of sadness in her voice. "I can see that he respects you, and in return, you've given him the confidence he never had." Alice could hear the vulnerability in Catherine's words, the regret of a mother who, for all her wealth and privilege, had never truly been able to connect with her son. It was a side of Catherine that Alice hadn't expected to see, a reminder that even the most formidable people carried their own burdens of guilt and longing. Later that evening, after the luncheon had concluded and the guests had departed, Matt invited Alice to join him in the drawing room. She was reluctant at first, feeling out of place in the grand room with its opulent furnishings and antique decor. But Matt was insistent, and soon they were sitting across from each other, a warm fire crackling in the hearth. "I wanted to talk to you about something, Alice," Matt said, leaning forward with a serious expression. "My mother's visit, it's made me realize something. For so long, I've been living in her shadow, trying to prove something, to live up to these expectations I didn't even fully understand. But since you came here, since you helped me see the world differently, I feel like I finally have a purpose." Alice smiled softly, touched by his words. "I think you always had a purpose, Matt. You just needed to look beyond yourself to find it." He nodded, clearly moved. "And that's exactly what you taught me. You showed me the importance of giving back, of using my position for something meaningful. And because of that, I've made a decision." He took a deep breath, his expression filled with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "I want to expand the scholarship program, not just for students in need, but for people of all ages who want to further their education and contribute to their communities. And I want you to oversee it, Alice. I trust you. I know you'll give it the heart and vision it deserves." Alice's heart swelled with pride, but she hesitated, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Matt, that's an incredible responsibility. Are you sure I'm the right person?" Matt looked at her with a sincerity that erased her doubts. "Alice, you're the only person who can make this vision a reality. You know what it means to struggle, to fight for every opportunity. And you've inspired me to do better, to be better. This isn't just my way of thanking you. It's my way of investing in the future we both believe in." Alice took a deep breath, absorbing the magnitude of what he was offering. She had started at the Harrison estate as a maid, a role defined by limitations and rigid expectations. But now, she was being given a chance to leave a lasting legacy, to shape the lives of countless others who, like her, had once felt overlooked and dismissed. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice filled with determination. "I'll make sure this program reaches people who need it most. We'll build something that lasts." Over the next few months, the scholarship program expanded, and Alice's role within the estate transformed even further. She worked closely with Matt, interviewing applicants, visiting schools, and establishing partnerships with local organizations. Each day, she was driven by a purpose that felt larger than herself, a mission that fulfilled her in ways she hadn't known were possible. Catherine, who extended her stay at the estate, began to play a supportive role in the program as well. She offered her own network and resources, bridging gaps that Alice and Matt couldn't have managed on their own. It was clear that Catherine was inspired by the changes in her son and by Alice's unwavering commitment. The three of them formed an unlikely alliance, working toward a common goal that transcended wealth, privilege, and status. One evening, after a particularly successful fundraiser for the scholarship fund, Alice found herself standing alone on the estate's grand terrace, gazing up at the stars. The cool night air was refreshing, and she took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. Just then, Matt joined her, a glass of champagne in his hand. He handed it to her, and they stood side by side, watching the twinkling lights above. "Do you remember the first day you arrived here?" Matt asked, a smile tugging at his lips. "I thought you were just another maid, someone I could ignore, someone who was beneath me. I can't believe how blind I was." Alice chuckled, shaking her head. "And I thought you were the most spoiled, entitled man I'd ever met. Funny how things change." They laughed together, a warm, genuine laughter that was free of judgment, free of past grievances. They had both grown, both shed the layers of their old selves, and now stood as equals, united by a shared vision and a mutual respect. "Alice," Matt said, his tone growing serious, "you've changed my life in ways I can't even begin to describe. You've shown me the power of humility, kindness, and compassion, and I'll never be able to thank you enough for that." Alice looked at him, her heart full. "You don't need to thank me, Matt. I think we both helped each other find our way. And that's all I ever wanted, to be part of something meaningful, to make a difference." As they stood there, watching the night unfold around them, Alice felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She had once been a stranger in the Harrison estate, an outsider in a world that seemed intent on keeping her at arm's length. But now she was part of a family, a force for good that had the potential to touch countless lives. In the days that followed, the scholarship program grew into a national initiative, drawing attention from philanthropists, educators, and community leaders across the country. Alice was recognized as the driving force behind its success, her story inspiring others to look beyond social divisions and to embrace the transformative power of empathy and respect. Years later, as Alice reflected on her journey, she realized that her time at the Harrison estate had been more than just a job. It had been a journey of self-discovery, of resilience, and of change. She had learned that true strength wasn't found in wealth or power, but in the courage to challenge one's own prejudices, to see beyond the surface, and to embrace the humanity in others. And as she continued her work, Alice carried with her the knowledge that even the smallest acts of kindness could leave an indelible mark, forging connections that could bridge worlds, heal wounds, and inspire change.